Warning: the following video contains scenes that some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. On January 14, 1869, Minnie Wallace was born in New Orleans. She was the daughter of James Elijah Wallace, a lawyer, and Elizabeth, his wife. Minnie's parents separated when she was still fairly young, but they made sure their two daughters had an education and were taught all the customs of the day. In the well-known Storyville region of New Orleans, Mrs. Wallace opened a boarding house on Canal Street after being divorced. The opulent brownstone and marble bordello at 40 Basin Street, built in 1863 by renowned bordello Madame Kate Townsend, was nearby. Mrs. Wallace had a keen business sense. Both of her daughters developed into stunning young women. She wanted them to entertain her guests by singing and playing the piano. The exposition, which attracted numerous people, debuted on December 16, 1884, and ran through June 2, 1885. One was James Reeves Walkup, an extremely wealthy businessman. He was born on August 10, 1836, in Marion County, Indiana, and was 48 years old at the time. He now resided in Emporia, Kansas, where he had previously served in the Civil War. His life had been filled with sorrow, and he had made his money working for the West Columbia Coal and Mining Company. Although he was married, his wife had passed away the following year. In 1858, he had his second marriage, and in 1867, he and his family migrated to Kansas. The family relocated once more around 1880, this time to Emporia. Here, he was chosen president of the council, and as such, any time the elected mayor was absent, he took over as mayor of the town. Tragically, on May 1, 1884, his second wife Hannah passed away, making him a second-time widower. But he had always been seen as a gentleman. In December 1884, Mr. James Reeves Walkup visited the Industrial and Cotton Centennial Exposition in New Orleans. Mr. Eben Baldwin, a gentleman, joined him. When they arrived in New Orleans, they were advised to stay in a boarding house on Canal Street in the renowned Storyville neighborhood by a man whom they had randomly met in Baton Rouge. When they first met Minnie and Dora, Mr. James Reeves Walkup appeared to be a little bit smitten with her. He expressed his desire to marry Mrs. Wallace's daughter to her. Not for the first time, a man had proposed to one of Mrs. Wallace's daughters. He wrote Minnie a letter after arriving in Emporia. He went back to New Orleans 4 months later. Elizabeth, her daughter, had expressed a desire to visit the exposition, thus the excuse. At Mrs. Wallace's boarding home on Canal Street, they booked accommodations. Once more, Mr. James Reeves Walkup requested permission from Mrs. Wallace to marry her daughter. Mrs. Wallace insisted that she and Minnie must first travel to Emporia to see Mr. Wallace before her daughter might accept his offer. In July 1885, they traveled, and Mrs. Wallace was awestruck by whatever she saw. It was clear from the huge residence and its elegant furnishings that Mr. James Reeves Walkup was truly a very successful and affluent gentleman. Minnie gave her consent to wed him. They got married on July 22, 1885, and the event was held in Covington, Kentucky. Mrs. Wallace went back to New Orleans in the midst of the wedding. Minnie was the lady of the mansion at this point. Her husband had to go to work for a few days. On August 15, he arrived back in Emporia and was welcomed by his wife. But he started to feel seriously ill later that evening. When Minnie requested a doctor, Dr. Luther Jacobs promptly showed up there. Her husband was ill, in a lot of discomfort, and experiencing stomach cramps. He developed the illness several times. Dr. Jacobs left the Walkup apartment and came back, by this time beginning to suspect something was wrong. He started to worry that his patient might have arsenic poisoning. Everyone seems to think that she was the one who poisoned her husband. Exactly 1 month after their wedding, Mr. James Reeves Walkup passed away later that day. The passing of such a well-known person in Emporia quickly became known throughout the city. When the authorities went to the neighborhood pharmacies, they found that Minnie had bought strychnine the day prior her husband fell ill. The days that followed saw her acquire 2 further arsenic products. When asked about the items she had bought, she responded innocently that she had just used the arsenic to massage her face, as well as that the strychnine was used only to get stains out of her clothes. Mrs. Minnie Wallace's Walkup was instructed to remain in her home while the police looked into the circumstances surrounding her husband's passing. The deceased's stomach, liver, and kidneys were taken by pathologists prior to the funeral so they could be further examined. Although Minnie's friends assisted her in getting ready for the funeral, she ultimately thought it would be better if she skipped it. She chose to pay tribute outside of the residence as a ceremonial passed by while dressed appropriately for the mourning. The physician claimed that Mr. Walkup told him about his prescription during the encounter, which contained combined opium and arsenic. According to Dr. Scott, when he questioned Mr. Walkup about why he was taking this, Mr. Walkup responded that he thought of arsenic as a male enhancement drug. She received a $4,000 contribution for her defense from Mr. William J., the minister guardian that the court had designated. William J. was no exception to her talent for attracting older gentlemen. He testified before the court that Mr. James Reeves Walkup had been to see him in his office in July 1885 and had mixed some white powder with water before drinking it. According to Mr. J., had urged him to clean the knife because the substance contained arsenic. Many people spoke in favor of her. She attended the witness stand with grace and informed the court that she had bought arsenic at her husband's request and put it in a drawer. Unbeknownst to her, he had directed a maid to deliver it to him, but because of his weak state, did not give the proper dosage. He consumed excessively and died as a result. She returned to New Orleans and began to socialize with William Pitt Kellogg, a former governor of Louisiana who was around 39 years her senior. After that, she relocated to Chicago. While visiting Chicago in 1897, she got to know a man by the name of Mr. John Burton Ketchum. He was charmed with Minnie, just like many men before him, to the point where he divorced his wife and married Minnie in Wisconsin in a private ceremony. Just 12 days after writing a will in which he gave his entire estate to his new wife, he passed away. An autopsy was carried out since Minnie's first husband had died from arsenic poisoning. It was determined that Mr. Burton Ketchum's death was caused by his alcoholism. This is a story that was spoken by everybody at the time. Thanks for being to the end of the video. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and tell us what you think about this video below in the comment section.